All right, I'm Jonas Kaufman from the Van der Ven group at UCSB, and today I'll be talking about some of my thesis work I've done on modeling layered materials for beyond lithium-ion batteries. First, I want to motivate why we and others are looking beyond lithium, and specifically at sodium and potassium, as alternatives for batteries. The main reason is that although sodium and potassium are heavier than lithium, they're about 1,000 times more abundant on Earth, as illustrated by this rescaled periodic table here. They're also geographically distributed far more evenly than lithium. And so this alone makes these technologies promising for applications such as large-scale grid energy storage for renewables, where weight is not as much of an issue as cost. However, one of the main drawbacks of sodium and potassium ion batteries is that their electrode materials tend to be more susceptible to degradation. And a lot of this has to do with additional phase transitions that do not occur with lithium. So much of our work has focused on understanding these phase transitions. Now I'll explain briefly how a rechargeable battery works. So this is a very simplified picture, but there are two electrodes, the anode, which is typically some form of carbon, and the cathode, which is often a layered metal oxide containing lithium or sodium or whatever ion is being used. So that's this A element. The electrodes are separated by an electrolyte, which conducts ions but not electrons, and the electrons flow through an external circuit, as shown here. Here I'm showing the battery voltage versus the A ion content in the cathode. And when you charge the battery, the ions are shuttled to the anode and the voltage increases. Then when you discharge the battery to use a device, the reverse happens. So the ions are shuttled from the anode to the cathode. Now, this is a very idealized picture and a very idealized voltage profile in that it's perfectly straight and fully reversible. And here I'm showing some actual measured voltage profiles for lithium cobalt oxide, which is a very common lithium ion cathode material, as well as its sodium counterpart, sodium cobalt oxide. And at a composition of x equals 1, both of these adopt the same type of layered structure as illustrated here, with the lithium or sodium, in this case, occupying two-dimensional layers between these cobalt oxide sheets. And as you can see, the lithium cobalt oxide voltage curve is fairly smooth, while the sodium curve is full of these steps and small plateaus. So each plateau here corresponds to a two-phase reaction between phases with different sodium contents. And when this occurs, there's often a structural phase transition in which these metal oxide sheets change their stacking, like so. And along with this, the sodium ions typically reorder within these layers so as to minimize electrostatic repulsion. And so strongly preferred orderings will appear as larger steps in the voltage profile, as shown here and here. And so these two effects are much more prominent in sodium and potassium ion cathodes and can be quite detrimental to battery performance. So what we do in our group is try to predict phase stability and phase transitions computationally. So here I'm showing the same experimental voltage curve for sodium cobalt oxide from the previous slide, compared to a voltage curve I calculated using density functional theory. And I obtained this by calculating the energies of different competing phases, shown here. So this is the energy versus sodium composition for various phases, some of which are shown here. And then by taking the convex hull or the envelope of lowest energy structures, this gives the equilibrium phase or combination of phases at any concentration. Then the cathode voltage is related to the chemical potential, which in this case is just the slope of this energy versus composition. So there's a very nice relationship between these formation energies and the actual voltage that is measured. And you can see that apart from a more or less fixed offset, the qualitative agreement between the calculated and experimental voltage curves is quite good. So we have this large step at 1/2 with many small steps on either side, and each of these correspond to a particular sodium ordering. And later on, I'll show what those orderings are, but first I want to take a step back and talk about how we actually go about simulating a system like this and predicting phase stability. So generally, we study crystals, which are made up of periodically repeating units of atoms in space. So for example, this 2D square lattice has a single atom at each lattice point. So it's a 2D crystal. And if we allow for configurational degrees of freedom, each site could, for example, be occupied by one of two different kinds of atoms. So like here, we have orange atoms and blue atoms. And one of these could represent a vacant site or no atom. So at any given composition, there are many possible configurations as illustrated here. And in modeling material, we want to know which of the allowed configurations are important. And so the most important configurations will be the lowest energy configurations, because those will be stable at 0 temperature. But we also need to know the energy of other configurations, because at finite temperature, the excited states could become thermally accessible. So in order to model systems like this with configurational degrees of freedom, we need a very fast way to calculate the energies of arbitrary configurations, because we generally need to consider a lot of configurations. So we rely on a formalism called the cluster expansion, which allows us to write the energy, or actually any property of the crystal, as an expansion over the occupation of individual sites, pairs, triplets, and so on. And so these sigma here are site variables, which encode the species at a particular site. And these V are interaction coefficients for particular clusters. So the infinite expansion here is exact. However, practically, we work with a truncated cluster expansion and try to learn these interaction coefficients, the V. So to create our cluster expansions, we develop and use a code called CASM. This is broadly how it works. We begin with a primitive parent crystal structure and define the degrees of freedom. So for example, sodium vacancy ordering in one of these layered structures that I've been showing. Then we enumerate many distinct configurations or orderings, starting from the smallest repeat units. We feed those structures into density functional theory. So we use VASP to calculate properties of those structures. And from there, we start to build a picture of the 0 temperature phase stability. We also feed the energies back into CASM and fit a truncated cluster expansion, which can be set up as a matrix equation like this. And this is an iterative process. So once we fit a reasonable cluster expansion, we can use it to iteratively predict low energy structures and calculate their energies using DFT, and then use the data to improve the fit. And from there, we can use the cluster expansion to run Monte Carlo simulations, which build a picture of finite temperature phase stability. Although today I'll just be showing 0 temperature DFT results because the systems I've studied happen to remain ordered at room temperature. Now I want to revisit this sodium cobalt oxide system I showed earlier and show what the predicted orderings look like at some compositions. So the allowed sodium sites in these 2D layers form a honeycomb network. And at a composition of x equals 1/2, there is this particular ordering on the honeycomb of these zigzags of sodium that is extremely favorable. So it results in this large step in the voltage. And this ordering has actually been confirmed experimentally. So we're in agreement there. Then what I predicted is that as the composition decreases, this ordering is actually retained locally, and vacancies are introduced as antiphase boundaries between domains of this ordering. And at even lower concentrations, it's the same, but the density of those boundaries just increases. Similarly, at compositions above 1/2, I found that there's a different kind of boundary that introduces additional sodium between regions of this 1/2 ordering. And then as the composition increases further, the density of these boundaries increases further. So in both cases, there's essentially a continuum of orderings with varying composition, with varying densities of antiphase boundaries. And this is somewhat unusual behavior, but I've also predicted the same phases in this P3 structure in potassium cobalt oxide and potassium chromium oxide. So these seem to be important phases in this class of materials. So far, these results have focused on the thermodynamics or the equilibrium properties, but we're also concerned with kinetics, or how transitions between these phases occur. And this is dictated, in this case, by how the sodium are able to diffuse and rearrange themselves within the crystal. So in this P3 structure, the sodium are confined to these 2D layers, but they can hop directly between these trigonal prismatic sites, as shown here and illustrated here on the honeycomb network. And this type of hop event is generally considered to be a low energy event, which means it'll happen quickly. But in highly ordered phases such as these, that's not necessarily the case. So to look at the kinetics in these orderings, what I did is select 2 representative orderings below and above 1/2 with the different kinds of antiphase boundaries I predicted. And I enumerated all the distinct nearest neighbor sodium hops in large supercells. And then I calculated migration energies for these hops, which is something that can be done using DFT. And as shown by these open-faced red arrows here, I found that almost all of the hops here are invalid, meaning that the sodium is hopping to an unstable position such that it will simply relax back to its original preferred position. So this illustrates that these orderings are very strongly preferred and don't tolerate defects well. However, there's one hop in this ordering that is allowed, shown by this black arrow, where the sodium right next to the boundary hops towards it. If we look at that more closely, we see that it actually corresponds to a kink forming in the antiphase boundary. And looking at the energy, the barrier here is extremely low. So this means that this would happen quite readily. And by looking at some additional hops, I found that these kinks can readily expand like so, which has the effect of translating the whole boundary through the crystal. Also in the other type of ordering with the other antiphase boundary, the same kind of mechanism can actually occur, just in this case with a 2-atom hop rather than a 1-atom hop. And the energy barrier is a bit higher. There's some defect energy, but this is still a relatively low barrier. And also in this case, once a kink is formed, it can expand such that the antiphase boundary itself can migrate. So this is a bit of an unconventional mechanism. And while it is plausible, some additional work is required to determine the macroscopic implications. That is, how much can this mechanism actually contribute to long-range diffusion? And so to start to probe macroscopic diffusion, I've constructed a very simple model of these domains where each atom is assigned a cell, as shown here, and each cell has a particular phase value, 0 or 1. And then the antiphase boundaries are implicitly represented as a transition of one phase, from one phase to the other. And so I encoded the allowed sodium hops onto this grid in a kinetic Monte Carlo model, which can simulate the behavior of a large supercell. And so here's an example simulation that I've run. So the left is showing the phase values for these grid cells in a long, skinny simulation cell. The middle here is the same cell, but with the boundaries actually shown explicitly and with a local composition pictured. And then by taking these local compositions and averaging them horizontally, we can obtain a one-dimensional composition profile as shown by this smooth black curve. And if we initialize it with a profile like this, where there's some variation in the composition, I can let it evolve and see that the boundaries become rougher and start moving around a lot. And after a long time, this profile will flatten out more. So the composition will become more homogeneous. And so this work is still ongoing, but the idea is that I'll be doing some spectral analysis on these composition profiles to try to understand the nature of the diffusion resulting from this antiphase boundary migration mechanism. So that's my talk. I'd like to acknowledge everyone in the Van der Ven group, past and present, as well as computing resources from NERSC and the NSF through our MRL at UCSB. And of course, the CSGF and everyone at Krell for a wonderful 4 years. So thanks for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions.